Hello and welcome. My name is Omar Dahi, and I'm joined today by Firat Demir to discuss the fallout from the tragic earthquake which struck Turkey and Syria on February 6. These were, as everyone knows by now, two earthquakes that struck in close succession with each other with dozens, if not hundreds of aftershocks. And the result was devastation for millions of people and tens of thousands, if not more, of lives lost. This is being already called at one of the biggest natural disasters in the region's history, perhaps compared to earthquakes that took place over a century or more ago. We're going to discuss the impact of the earthquake. We're also going to discuss to what extent this natural disaster could have been mitigated, addressed, both in terms of the preparation for it as well as the aftermath. Of course, this is a tragedy that has struck both Turkey and Syria. The region in Syria where it struck is the northwest, which was and has been a region that has been suffering from a decade or more of conflict and has some of the highest humanitarian needs in the entire region. More than 4 million people depend on direct humanitarian assistance for survival before the earthquake. In this interview, we're going to focus mostly on the Turkish side in the lead up to the earthquake, in the aftermath of the earthquake, and of course, given the fact that there are millions of Syrians in that region and inside Turkey, this has obviously impacted Syrians inside Turkey as well. But for now, we're going to focus mostly on the events and their consequences inside Turkey. Firat, to give us a sense of the scale of the disaster and your impressions, if you could just give us your initial reaction to what's happening.
This is humongous in terms of scale, as Seda said. One report by the Business Confederations of Turkey today puts the number of deaths to exceed 70,000 people. The official numbers are only for those that are counted, but there are thousands who are buried without being registrations and so on. So that's going to exceed 70,000 people, according to an estimate. The monetary cost is also huge in terms of scale. That's going to exceed $80 billion, which will take decades to recover from. And the total number of people affected in this region is around 15 million people. And the population density is around 50% higher in the cities than the Turkish in general, Turkey. That compounded the effect and the scale of the earthquake. Several cities are completely wiped out. The reports shows that Antioch, for example, Hatay, is completely gone. There's not a single building left. The thousands of years of history are wiped out too. Adıyaman, Malatya are also quite completely destroyed. There are towns, districts that are not a single building is left. And this will have decades-long impacts, both one in terms of reconstruction, if it will be reconstructed, human capital effects in terms of the death and number of people. And many of them got hit at the city centers, which is where most of the economic and also human activity took place.
So in moments like this, there are always calls not to politicize the tragedy, not to discuss the political economy, the politics, the history, and to pay attention to the suffering. And I agree with that. But at the same time, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are increasing critiques. There's a sense of anger at both preparation for such an event like this and also the fallout, the aftermath, the response. Of course, we know and everyone knows that this is an earthquake region. We know, of course, about the tragic 1999 earthquake. Naturally, any earthquake of this magnitude is going to have devastation. So it's hard to say that this could have been prevented. But what is your sense in terms of, was something like this somehow expected? Was it complete surprise? Did it catch everyone by surprise? And then since 1999, what has been the actual preparation for a moment like this? I know there was a lot of laws and taxes and other processes put in place to try and address that. What has been the impact of those, at least our assessment at this first initial glance at this? And second, what is your reading of the response by the many different relevant parties, so to speak?
I mean, yeah, I fully agree. If you start with your first question, was it predictable? The answer is yes, it was predictable. Over 92% of Turkish population live on earthquake-prone regions. Anybody who is from Turkey has lived through multiple earthquakes in just last 20 years alone. And this is very well known. So fact one is Turkey, the whole country is on earthquake regions, and multiple fault lines pass through major cities, including Istanbul and many others. Give an example, in 2020, just 3 years ago, Kahramanmaraş, which is one of the cities that is hit by the earthquake and the center was there, it was actually chosen as the disaster risk reduction pilot project by the government itself. And the goal was to prepare the city against a 7.5 magnitude earthquake. So this was known. Every single earthquake expert, geologists and others have been warning that there is going to be an earthquake in this part of Turkey in a short while. Because according to those reports, the pressure was building for the last 200 years when no major earthquake took place on this fault line, which is Eastern Anatolian fault line. And even just a couple of weeks before the earthquake hit, the mayor of Antioch was telling, yes, it's going to happen, but they are not prepared. Every single expert on TV, just even in 2022, were warning about a possible earthquake here. So it was predictable. What about preparedness? The government was, quote, completely unprepared. The 1999 earthquake, which killed over 30,000 people near Istanbul, the Gölcük earthquake. After that, Turkey passed a special emergency tax to help prepare both for recovery efforts and also to help prepare for future earthquakes. The tax was intended to be for 1 year to generate enough revenue. That was 99. Even today, that tax is in place. People have been paying for over 30 years this emergency tax to prepare for earthquake. The estimates show the total amount of tax revenue for this fund to be around $38 billion. Most of this money is not used to reinforce buildings or disaster preparation. The minister of the government, many of them actually admitted and acknowledged in multiple occasions they use this funding not for earthquake preparedness, but for building roads or other priorities that they deemed more important than preparing for earthquake. That is one. Two, in terms of preparedness, there's a complete lack of merit-based appointments in Turkish government. That has been going on for decades, but just to make the obvious case, the president of AFAD, the official Turkish disaster first responders unit. So they are the ones who are supposed to be coordinating and directing all the aid efforts and first responders units. The director of it, or the president of it, he has a degree in theology. His master's education and his thesis was on Sufi theology in particular, with no engineering or emergency training whatsoever. The Turkish Red Crescent also completely failed, and it is also rampant with nepotistic appointments. For example, the former prime minister's family members are appointed to many of the high-ranking seats in the Turkish Red Crescent with pretty much no past experience or education regarding disaster responses. Three, the building code violations are very widespread in Turkey. According to a business association report, over half of the buildings that are affected by the earthquake were built after 2001. That is when the current government came to power. Corruption is very widespread. Anybody from Turkey could tell you that it's not that difficult to get a permit, even if your building is substandard or violated multiple building codes. The populism is a major part of it also. The current government, AKP, passed 8 construction amnesties. For our listeners who are not familiar with this term, construction amnesty means the government gives a permit in exchange for a small fine to forgive your building code violation. So you build your code substandard, violating the building codes. You can get away with it by paying a fine if there's an amnesty. The current government passed 8 of them in the last 20 years. So every 3 years, there was an amnesty passed. In 2018 alone, in Antioch, Hatay, which is completely wiped out from the earthquake, 70,000 buildings enjoyed and applied for permits for the construction amnesty. The public buildings, which are supposed to have 1.5 times earthquake standards. So any government building in Turkey, according to the building code, needs to be built 1.5 times the average standard in that city. But if you look at the earthquake, every single government building collapsed. The hospital in Hatay, for example, the state hospital, was on the government's demolishment list for the last 12 years. The government itself found that this building is not safe to operate 12 years ago, and it collapsed with all the patients inside with this earthquake. The Hatay airport, which is unusable right now, it was built by draining a lake on an active fault line when every single scientist told the government not to do it. So we knew this was going to happen. It was predictable. We were not prepared for it. And the response also, as a result, has been significantly lacking. One is there's no accountability. The government, starting from the first day, tried to shift the responsibility from itself to destiny and God. The president himself came out to the TV and said this is part of their fate and fate. The troll account started an active campaign to portray this as under the hashtag disaster of the century. The media, 95% of which is controlled by the government or pro-government, censored demands and protests of survivors from the earthquake regions themselves. The social media is full of snapshots of these video interviews. When the moment people start protesting or raising concerns for lack of action, the journalists start walking away, in one case running away from the survivors. People do not have basic necessities. This is the sixth day, as Seda mentioned. There's a serious risk of contagious diseases because there's no basic sanitation, no water, no heating. Many died under the rubble from hypothermia. Many experts suggested the lack of action in the first 2 days. The president did not come to the TVs until the second day. There was nobody on the ground for the first 2 days. And today is the sixth day, and there are reports on media that there are still buildings and parks and towns in remote areas, not city centers, where responders, first responders, or aid units did not go yet. So many died from frostbite, from hypothermia, because the temperatures in the evening are minus. People are told to bury their loved ones. There are lots of pictures and videos online you can find where people are carrying the bodies of their loved ones on their backs, on motorcycles or any other unit that they can get. On wheelbarrows, people are carrying their loved ones to bury. The government, in response, declared martial law intensities. There's no accountability in terms of those who built, who gave the permits. We knew, and everybody knows in Turkey, what needs to be done after an earthquake, because after 99 earthquake, nobody was found guilty for not following the procedures. Those buildings that collapsed, you need to take samples from them so that you can test and show what the pressure, what's the concrete amount, what steel and iron or others were used, so that you can bring charges against those who constructed them. They are being demolished without any accountability, without any samples, without any prosecutors being present. The government is trying to have damage control and change the narrative. They shut down Twitter to prevent protests leaking, according to some claims, and they slowed down the internet bandwidth. Many people are reported to be detained for protesting or criticizing the government for lack of action or their incompetence. The government yesterday announced they are shutting down universities for the rest of the academic year, and they will move remote online. And one suggestion is that they are doing this to open up space in the dorms for the survivors instead of placing them in hotels. Some could argue that that is to prevent a shutdown of the tourism industry, which the government desperately needs, the fresh inflow of money. What Seda mentioned also, there's a complete distrust of the government agencies, aid agencies. Most of the aid is going to private relief efforts and donations. And there has been multiple cyber attacks against those private donation efforts. The donation efforts from the cities or other NGOs are being censored or are prevented or targeted to be channeled to the government ones. And that makes it very sectarian and increases the lack of trust for the government.
So there's a lot there to unpack and also a lot to follow up on in terms of the response. Of course, there's also the international failure as well, the United Nations, discussions about cross-border aid and so on that we can discuss in a subsequent interview and discussion. But my last question to you for now is regarding perhaps the political and societal fallout from this. Not to predict the future, but also in terms of what's happening right now. And I think this is something that is perhaps changing day by day, but obviously this is happening to a country with deep political fault lines and polarization. As someone who follows the question of Syrian refugees, it's been apparent that there's a increasing backlash over the past months and few years against all refugees, not just Syrian refugees, but particularly if we focus on this region, given the fact that there's increasing Syrian refugees, there's lots of other fault lines as well. But if you can comment a little bit on some of the what we see as increasing perhaps backlash and scapegoating of minoritized populations, refugees, and other vulnerable groups, which could see even sort of another round of targeting perhaps as a result of this.
I think at the beginning you mentioned like disasters and whether it should be politicized. I see the whole tragedy is political, starting from whether it was predictable, were we prepared, and the question of why similar sized earthquakes do not kill as many people in other places that are much better prepared than in Turkey, especially in a place like Turkey that is prone to earthquakes. Now, regarding the social reactions, the way I see it is there's an increasing effort that is orchestrated, I think, top down, to direct the anger, which is a lot on the ground. People living and trying to survive right now. There's a lot of anger built in that part of Turkey and the rest of the country. And there's an orchestrated effort to direct that anger to other targets. And refugees is one of them. Foreigners is another one. The German and Austrian relief agencies that are helping with the rescue efforts in Turkey announced yesterday that they are going to freeze their relief efforts because of lack of safety. And the Turkish Interior Minister came out and accused them of spreading a smear campaign against Turkey. The Turkish government is well known for the last at least decade to be quite anti-Western in its rhetoric, either be that European Union or other. And many of the aid and relief efforts on the ground are coming from Western-led efforts, Western-led teams. So there's an increasing effort, I think, to direct the anger towards Syrian refugees who are portrayed as looters. There's also politicization of who is guilty and who should be targeted. Somebody who is trying to survive without any water, no food for the first 2 days, and still 6th day, there are many parts where aid still did not arrive. These people are trying to survive. So when you are trying to get water, food for your loved ones, for your kids, for yourself, should you be labeled as a looter? That needs to be discussed. And two, why are you directing it to refugees who went through 12 years of civil war and they found refuge in Turkey and trying to survive this disaster on top of that? Why are they targeted? And those are all politicized incidences, plus the targeting of anger towards the European efforts or American efforts for the relief efforts. There's a lot of rumors being spread and lots of pollution and noise that are spread on social media. And we don't see much effort from the social media companies either to censor or limit that type of hate speech that is very widespread on the social media in Turkey.